Hello, and welcome to the Joyscape Therapy podcast, a community for professionals in the field of applied behavior analysis, where board certified behavior analysts like BCBAs, SLPs, OTs, even parents of children with autism, neurodivergent individuals, and in general, anyone seeking to learn more about ABA or about interacting with individuals with autism or related diagnoses. Tune in as we dive into episodes discussing perspectives related to shaping behavior in professional and professional settings, allowing for behavioral principles related to everyday life. Our motto here is everyday behavior for everyday people. A reminder that with listening to our episodes, you can earn 1 continued education credit. So listen here for the code words, then visit our website at www.joyscapetherapy.com/CEUS. You'll enter the code words there and your BACB info at checkout, and then receive your certificate in 5 to 7 business days. If you love our content, please follow us on socials such as Facebook and Instagram at Joyscape Therapy, where you can find fun activities to facilitate play with children, creating interactive learning opportunities, and other relatable content. I'm your host, Marissa McKenzie, and to help discuss today's topic of executive functioning skills, today we have my colleague, Tammy Luu. Welcome, Tammy.
Hi.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and just like a mini intro as we get into our discussion topic for today.
All right. So I stumbled into ABA and it's been 6 years now. And so now I'm a BCBA. And that's kind of what I do. I am currently pursuing a master's in cyber psychology. And in my free time, I like to do crafts.
Oh, I love that. Oh, I will need to get into what do you mean cyber psychology? You're currently in school right now?
I am. I just started my first term.
Wow, look at you. So tell us just briefly, like, what can you do with cyber psychology?
That's a good question. It's a it's a pretty new field. So, I mean, they advertise it as like you can go into UX design or IT or cybersecurity. So it's pretty broad. For me, it was kind of like, well, that sounds really interesting. Maybe we can look into how I can use the information to kind of teach kids, or like, let's talk about internet safety because everyone's online and on tablets and everything.
Yeah.
Or like, I don't know, just I figured it'd be interesting to learn about.
Nice. Well, that kudos to you taking that on because that, must be hard, especially already being a BCBA. So I love that. I love that growth for you.
Thanks.
So for our audience here, today we'll be referencing work conducted by Adele Diamond, as well as work conducted by Jonathan Tarbo on executive functioning skills. We'll link the article and the resources in our show notes, so you can find that there to follow along. And Adele Diamond also has some really great YouTube videos that break down her work on studying executive functioning. And she's very eloquent in the way that she breaks these harder concepts down and kind of how to really understand them from a developmental perspective. So Tammy, I know we kind of decided on this topic together. I'd love to hear like how are executive functioning skills relevant for you, or like, what brought you about like having interest in this topic?
Yeah. So I actually have ADHD. And so executive function for me is difficult. And so it resonates. And every time I watch one of my clients and I'm thinking, oh, you're probably having a really hard time paying attention right now, even though you want to, it's just over and again, it's like, oh, this is relevant. This is something that I need to know about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh, great. I know for me, like even just when we had initially done this internal CE on executive functioning, we actually did it last year. I really learned a lot. And I think finding Adele Diamond was super helpful. And like even just the different modalities of learning with her YouTube videos, it really helped me understand like even some of the struggles I have with like just organizing when you have so much things. And I'm sure, like parents who have multiple kids, right? Or even just one kid, it's very hard to multitask and kind of keep things in order. I'm a paper and pen gal. So like I have one paper planner and I have like 3 like digital calendars, and still I forget things. And I get so disappointed with myself, like when I forget to like schedule something or overbook myself. So, just kind of in relating how executive functioning skills are embedded within our daily life. For me, I see them a lot in like personal appointments or helping to care for my mother, even projects that I'm working for, on my day-to-day, scheduling meetings, meeting deadlines. So just kind of like overall adulting skills.
Yeah, I think that's like deadlines is hard. Like I have to have a deadline from someone else, someone that's external. Deadlines for myself on a personal level are very difficult. And then doing things like getting the bills paid or setting up appointments for myself are very, very hard. And like just doing tasks. So crafts, I love them, and yet somehow I have to have like a muse or something in order to actually get started on it. So
I see. Yeah. So even just trying to understand how like EF skills are relevant in our practice as BCBAs. So we know that the clients that we work with often experience challenges in these areas. And if we're programming for them, it is super essential that we're educated on like the developmental part of them, right? Like I know that was a big piece for me learning. It's just like in the lifespan, where do executive functioning skills come into play, and like what do they look like at certain ages, right? I think that was like a big learning experience for me. And then also understanding, how to program for those particular skills. Are they age appropriate? I think that's the biggest thing that stood out for me. But yeah, how about, what's your take on it, Tammy?
oh gosh, I have like a soapbox for this. um where it's just, yeah, I mean, I think understanding when when people develop certain executive functioning skills is really important. And then also understanding that some children are developing more slowly
Yeah.
in those skills, right? And then so, but like oftentimes as we're working, even as BCBAs and like as other professionals, we find that we expect kids to do a lot of things that they're really not at the age to have to be able to do.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that it's you're right that we need to know.
Yeah. And the one that comes to mind like a little more immediately, or even just thinking like in my beginning years when I wasn't as like informed, or I feel like in general educated, right? I think it's important to be vulnerable here in that, even though we graduate with our master's degree, I think it's important to understand, like, for example, planning for a behavior intervention plan, and then putting like coping skills for a 2 or 3, even a 4-year-old, right? Like, yes, we can put those in, but really truly understanding like to what extent, right? What do those coping skills look like? How do we really teach those to a kiddo that is really at the beginning stages of like developing those skills, right? So I think that despite all the education, the knowledge that we have coming out of our program, is really understanding like what that looks like translating over, because there are a lot of pieces, even understanding like developmental psychology, and embedding that within how we program, and using our colleagues and resources, I think has been something that I've matured into. It's definitely taken some time, because I was that one who was like program like coping skills, just almost a template, right? Not really a template, but just kind of embedding that in there as like more of muscle memory versus actually individualizing that, which I'm glad that we all should be doing.
Yeah, like the whole, all right, well, everybody needs to know how to breathe and count to 10, right? That's what
Yeah.
you're doing.
Exactly. Or like the waiting, right? Like it's really hard for a little a kid, even to wait. It's hard for adults to wait.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's hard for us to sometimes, I think, to take turns in conversation, but we expect the kids to do that.
Oh, that's such oh, that's good. That is really good. Yeah. As I like slow myself down. Yeah, like the active listening piece too. I was reading into like working memory, and like the inhibition control, right? To be able to like hold and still process. I was like, oh, those are really complex skills. So yeah, let's get into it. And yeah, I think we touched on like, why is it so challenging, right?
Yeah. And I've been thinking about this too. And like, there's this idea when you're like giving examples is sometimes helpful for like neurotypical people to understand. And I think about like when you look at how you make an appointment to go to the doctors or how you get a prescription and all those things. And I don't know, like for you, like when you go to the doctor, when you're planning to go to the doctor, what are your steps for making an appointment?
Ooh, okay. So I go onto my app and I already have my doctor assigned. So then I have to search through which appointment will be best for my schedule. And then are you talking about like going to the doctor as well?
Yeah, just like, oh, I guess let's keep it short, I guess, and just keep it at making the doctor's appointment. What does that look like for you?
Okay, yeah. Honestly, it is a little bit challenging sometimes because the app like only shows so many availability. So then I got to like remember, oh, that one could work, but let me see if there's a different one. And then I go to the next page and then I'm like, nope, it's not. So then I got to like go back. But yeah, I just kind of use my visual calendar that I have on like on my written form and then I'm looking and referencing the app. That's usually my process. What is yours?
My process is emotionally getting ready to have to sign into the website. Just so I
Oh.
have to like go into the website and then I have to if my password and username are not already like saved, right? Then I have to like go in and sign in. And I mean I'm passwords are easier now because my husband made me download his password manager. So I don't have to remember all of my passwords, but that was also an issue. And then to go in, find the button for making appointments. And then what you're saying about like looking at your calendar and figuring it out, right? But the thing is for me, I have to pack my calendar or I get really stressed about like what am I gonna do in my downtime? So now I'm looking at okay, I'm available for the doctor's at this time, but then how long does it take me to drive from this place to this other place? But I also have a really terrible sense of time and understanding of how time flows. So I'll plan for something like, okay, I think it takes me half an hour to get from here to here. Um, and then I'm probably wrong, you know. So there's all of that. But I'm trying to figure out how long it'll take me to travel. It's like, okay, I can make this appointment time work. And then I actually set the appointment up. And then I have to go and put it on my calendar, but I don't ever do that right after I make the appointment for some reason. So I have to like check my email again, put it in there afterwards. Um, but it's all like an emotional, like I have to get started. I have to do this.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that was fun. Thank you for that exercise. That was fun. And I think it hopefully also gives our listeners a little bit of insight, right? Like I think everyone's experience might have some similarities, but also it's nice to hear like the first thing that stood out for me was your, like you mentioned, the emotional task it is to even sign in, right? When you mention passwords, I also get very stressed out because although I have mine signed, it's like if I got prompted or if I forgot it one time, I don't know, and then I had to change it, that really stresses me out sometimes. But yeah, it's interesting to hear like even to get started, um, it was more of a challenge for you.
Yeah, like I think there's some things that people kind of take for granted as a skill, right? Like it's easy to do. And I think for someone like me, where frankly I'm not like super impaired, right? Like I'm getting work done and doing things, but it's still like there are a lot of steps actually to doing this. And
Mm-hmm.
it's stressful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
So as we look into just kind of things we want to touch on for today. So yeah, what is executive functioning? What does it look like from a developmental standpoint? And how do EFs relate to ABA? And we'll share some considerations we might have in programming for EF skills. So kind of starting off, what is EF, right? What is executive functioning? So it's a cognitive process in which stems from the prefrontal cortex of the brain. So it's like a mixture of components involving planning, shifting, organizing, even some memorization in there. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of things. Tammy, did you want to add anything more specific to kind of the definition or understanding of EF?
No, I think that's like a really good broad definition. It's like it's everything you need to do things, right? So it's like initiating, executing, completing the task. But yeah.
Right. And so, it's so interesting because yesterday, kind of story time, I'll give yesterday. I don't know if I've shared a little bit on the podcast, but my mom, she had a stroke a few years back. So she actually has aphasia. The stroke affected her prefrontal cortex. So learning about some of this, kind of had my own motivation, because it definitely does pertain to some of the struggles that I see my mom have on a day-to-day. So yesterday, my mom and we were actually playing some games. We played Candyland. That was super fun, but Candyland is super quick. So we went on to play Guess Who. And we've played Guess Who before, maybe a year or two back. But yeah, she struggles. She's also like, there's a tumor in that same area of the brain. So, there might have been a little bit of like lower, some more damage, what I mean. So we've played Guess Who before, but it was almost like this was her first time ever playing. So I could visually see, like from a behavioral standpoint, I could recognize some of the cues that she was struggling to process, like, oh, how do we play? She got the cards and had it all set up, but she like almost wanted to pass out the cards. So you could tell she like pausing, her eyebrows are scrunched. So, just kind of hearing, because one thing we'll touch on later is like the behavioral standpoint and kind of that mentalistic standpoint, right? Because when we're talking about EF and all these things, there are definitely private events occurring, right? And so how to kind of understand that. So when my mom and I were playing Guess Who, and with the questions, if you ever played Guess Who, so it can only be a yes, no question. So initially her first question is your person a boy or girl? And so I tell her, Mom, it's only yes, no questions. And so she pauses and proceeds again saying, like she's like expressing her, like, I don't get it. But then she eventually gets out, is it a girl? And I say, nope. Just super, super short, let her kind of hold that and process it. And then she again looks pretty confused as she's motioning to put like which one to put down. And then, so she then is, kind of doing that reverse negation. Like you could see she was struggling to understand which one do I put down. So I tried helping her with kind of a directive, right? So, Mom, my person is a boy. So you have to put down, and I kind of left it open for an interverbal, right? And she was still very confused. So she could say she's going to put down girl, but she couldn't actually like put down girl. So she pauses again and tries to process. And then she finally ends up saying it. But this is maybe within a little over a minute of just this one task. So, even when we're talking about some of the executive functioning that's at play, and this is a fun leisure activity that my mom and are engaging in, but it really put into perspective, and it was so timely, like nothing planned for this either in terms of, now we're recording this episode and I'm like, oh, how great. Like it's a good example because I witnessed it so fresh in my mind. And yeah, so I just thought that was a fun example to kind of share of like, the process to utilizing executive functioning skills can be different for multiple people. And particular with my mother who has that damage in her prefrontal, you could really see signs of she's struggling, but she's trying to fight that. So I can't imagine, what that internal challenge might be like, where you're kind of really processing things.
Wow, that's actually a much better example than the one I just gave. I mean, because I think it's one of those things like, yeah, for us, it's so simple, right? Like boy, girl, yeah, of course, because we've played this game so many times. But then for someone who is trying to work through the steps of like holding that idea in, right? And then moving based on that, like I think that's, yeah, a really good example of how difficult it can be to kind of break down those steps in your mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tammy, did you want to share any particular like examples that you've had, even if it is in like teaching EF skills or anything further, kind of before we move on to more developmental stages?
No, I don't think I have anything that pops out right now.
Yeah. All right. So kind of just looking at like populations affected by EF kind of dysfunction would be like ASD, traumatic brain injury, learning disabilities, ADHD, just to name a few. In a presentation conducted by Jonathan Tarbow, he emphasized these prefrontal cortex operations like inhibitory control, organizing, planning, goal setting, memory, just to name a few. And around teenage years, the working memory and the shifting attention and inhibition control, they stabilize within adolescent period with EF higher level, closer to 20. So maturity for kind of executive functioning skills really is within like the closer to 20 years old for an individual. So this is a big shocking when you consider all the pivotal things we do before the age of 20. I mean, we're going through puberty, right? Before then, we're experiencing peer pressure, high school in general. I mean, high school is an event in itself. And choosing a college, moving out of your family home, getting or having, maintaining a job. So I think all of these things are important to point out that just because EF isn't fully mature until 20 years old, that doesn't mean we aren't exercising EF muscles years prior. We have to do things like problem solving, utilizing creative thinking, just things like that. But yeah, how do you think ASD and executive functioning, like where do you think they intersect?
Well, ASD is a developmental disorder. So, and we're talking about like the development of executive functioning up until at least age 20, right? And then we're looking at people with ASD and how their brains are developing. And so the likelihood is that they're also behind. And by likelihood, I mean, the research shows that the development of EF is also behind. And then I also like think about how a lot of autistic people are dealing with like lots of extra sensory input that maybe everyone else is not feeling, or maybe they're dealing with like hyposensory input, right? And then I'm just trying to imagine if everyday life felt for me like jets were flying over my head and lights were switching on and off and things smelled weird and I don't know where it's coming from. Or like I'm hungry, but I don't even maybe know that I'm hungry, but it's bothering me. All of those things would mean that I can't get work done. There's no way that I can pay attention to what I need to pay attention to with all of those distractions.
No, so true. One thing Tarbo points out in his presentation is with the core criteria for ASD, one of them is restricted or repetitive behaviors. So this could look as severe as skin picking and as obvious a fixated interest. For example, high interest or limited conversation outside of topics other than, let's say, maps, right? A kiddo might be really focused on maps, that their super favorite thing, but also that's their only thing they can talk about, right? And this is really to a level in which interrupts their ability to connect with other people, to branch off in other topics of conversation. So with that being said, some of those restricted and repetitive behaviors might bleed into one's ability to dial into executive functioning skills, right? A lot of times in ASD, we see OCD-like behaviors. And this is, as you can imagine, adding another layer for the ability to perform some of those executive functioning skills with ease. So just a few things to kind of consider.
It's actually funny that you say you're talking about kind of that rigidity, because one of the notes I wrote for myself was the idea of like, don't kick the dead horse. It's such a morbid saying, but like, stop talking about that. We're done with the conversation. And I don't know about everyone else, but I find it very hard not to kick the dead horse, because when someone else is done with the conversation, does not mean that I'm done with that conversation. Because in my head, like, those details are still missing. We need to fill in those details, or like I need to complete this, like I need to get closure on this conversation. And so I think in that way too, there's that kind of rigidity of like, no. And I've never thought of myself as like being someone who perseverates, but in that way I do.
Interesting. That's a good share. Does it always pertain? Because I know sometimes, admittedly, I might be like that in an argument with like a friend or somebody, right? It's kind of like, no, we're gonna resolve this. Like, I need you to hear my perspective. But is that just kind of in like neutral situations as well when you're discussing a topic?
Yeah, we can be in agreement, and we've already like figured out that yes, we both agree with what's happening, and we're both upset about it, maybe, right? But the other person was like, okay, cool, I'm done with my rant, done, I'm leaving and do something else. And I'm like, no, but let me continue to tell you how upset I am about the situation.
Yes. Oh man. So yeah, executive functions are mental processes making it possible for us to stay focused and pay attention, reason and problem solve, a lot focused within goal-oriented behavior. using choice, discipline, and self-control to avoid impulsive decision-making, seeing things from different perspectives, seeing how different facts or ideas relate to each other, reflecting on the past or even imagining the future, and being flexible by adjusting to change or new information. So this entails a ton. And I can't imagine, like really understanding the importance of EF skills and examples that happen in everyday, in everyday life. So 3 core executive functioning skills are inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. So these are pretty hefty, and Tammy, feel free to step in wherever. But within inhibitory control, we have basically the ability to hold back from doing something. And this entails 2 kind of sub areas, self-control, and in that we see it involves resisting temptation. So involves persistence to stay on task despite knowing there's a long road ahead. And I bring up this example for myself because, so example of paying off my own student loans and budgeting. So prior to the pandemic, I had about $35,000 of student loans, and I paid that off in 3 years, but I had a lot of help, right? So I started kind of using this budgeting method. Shout out to the budget mom on Instagram. But she has really great visuals. And to this day, I still use it. And I also stay committed because I love the visual process of seeing myself being able to, if I paid an extra $50, I color in a little line. So they have like these visuals that really help see your progress and kind of break it down. It's like it's like you see the light at the end of the road or at the end of the tunnel. And although that tunnel is long, being able to say, okay, I feel myself taking one step closer, whether that be just automated payments, extra payments. So kind of chipping away at it. And that kind of reminded me, because I had to really hone in on some of my spending. And when I wanted to like go clothes shopping, or I wanted to treat myself to a spa day, like that really took focus on like, okay, I really want to do that, but I can plan for that in a month, right? Like I don't have to do it today. And so just some like examples of how I've kind of incorporated like some of that inhibitory control, and like seeing that, yes, I could be rewarded right now, but that won't get me closer to my larger overarching goals, which was like, to get rid of this debt and be able to just have a little bit more of that financial freedom. So kind of resisting those urges for something bigger for me personally.
Are you familiar with the marshmallow test?
No.
They do with kids? I'm thinking about there's this experiment that they did. I believe they replicated pretty recently, but it's like you put a kid in a room and then you give them one marshmallow.
Oh, yes. Yes. And like if they wait, they get more, or if they wait to eat it or something like that, they get more marshmallows.
Right. Yeah. I think like that's kind of what it is, right? Like, let's not do it now because I can get a lot more once I'm done with paying off my loans.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, within that inhibitory control is also inference control. So this is controlling attention, behavior, your thoughts, emotions, and fighting that internal pull to react. So Diamond mentions this as mind wandering. So this is just the ability to control one's attention, thoughts, and resisting distractions within the environment. And so I can give an example. I have experience in working with adults in a group home. And so it was interesting because there was a situation with a resident who she does have, we have to watch her diet. So she has a pretty strict diet. And, sorry, let's shift. This is not the food example. This is the morning routine tasks. So she has to brush her teeth and put her dirty clothes away and then get dressed for her day before she could come out to eat breakfast. Meanwhile, she hears the rest of the residents and, the chairs for the dining table kind of wrestling, right? So she's really kind of speeding through her process. And then the resident kind of loses focus and she comes out with her pajama bottoms and her school top. And so she's halfway there, but not quite, right? So this is like, she's hearing things going on in the kitchen from her room, and she knows she has to do like these tasks before she usually can come out and, get to that step of her morning routine. But it's just so interesting, and it's such a natural thing where, even all the staff are just looking like, oh, like you got to do something first before you come back. So, just kind of understanding too of like programming for different ages, different levels of functioning, different, individualizing it to certain aspects. And so oftentimes, especially with adults, you see a lot of adaptive living skills, a lot of goals in there, but those are also, the most challenging to program for, right? Because they have so many steps, and to account for things like noise. It's like, we know she's usually used to her routine. She's, getting her shirt and her shoes and her socks, but then we can't account. It's harder to plan for, the rush of hearing everyone else going to get their food, but she's not done yet. So she's just like, putting her, we see this often with younger kids where they might put their shirt on backwards because they're rushing or not paying attention. But yeah, Tammy, do you have anything to add for like how we might program for situations like adaptive living skills, or even just incorporating inference control?
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to what you're saying about individualizing, right? Is like, well, what is it that's distracting them? At what point is it necessary to kind of worry about? Like, I think about a lot of people use shopping lists, and it's kind of the same idea, because you walk into the store and you get distracted by all the other things that you can buy, and especially if you're hungry, then you want to buy everything. But that list kind of keeps you in check, right? And so I think for a lot of tasks, it's kind of that idea of like, well, will they benefit from maybe a visual or like self-management skills? Like, okay, what do I need to do to make sure that I complete this task? A list to check off as I'm doing things. I need to have pictures to help me remember that, like, yeah, I got to do that. Or, people use the whole rubber band on the wrist thing. I don't know if that works for anyone, but that's a thing. Yeah, and so I think it's kind of like teaching those self-management skills of like figuring out what you need at what point, and how to kind of implement that, and then keep yourself in check.
Yeah. Do you find visuals are helpful? Like, do you use your phone for things? I'm trying to think of like easy things that maybe we haven't kind of thought outside of the box for when thinking about programming for, our clients who are younger.
I do use my phone, but I think what ends up happening is I get bored. So like, for example, if I have an alarm or an event on my calendar, like a recurring event, and it pops up and it reminds me, you got to do this, I will heed it the first few times, and then I start to ignore it. And I think that is actually a pretty common phenomenon. I can't remember the name of the person who was talking about this, but she's like an executive function coach, and she mentioned the idea of like micro changes can help keep you interested, because like executive functioning wise, like, sometimes it's just that your brain is not interested enough in what's happening to get it done, right? I mean, like the example you have about getting dressed and food, I mean, my brain is now more interested in that food than I am in getting dressed. So that's where I'm going. And so if you need to kind of program for things that are going to be routine, then maybe you also have to program for like what happens when their brain gets really bored of this thing. So with a planner, right? Like maybe instead of having to worry about, well, I tried this planner and I tried that planner, but I always end up throwing it away because I don't use it. Sometimes you use, this is actually her example. Sometimes maybe you use the calendar on your phone as your planner. And then when your brain gets bored of that, you switch to the calendar, that giant calendar on your wall. And when your brain gets bored of that, you do a little paper planner and you switch back between them.
Yes. Oh, I love that. So that brings us to our first code word for today, which is flexibility. And we're going to go into the category of cognitive flexibility. So really being able to see different viewpoints on a similar topic and shifting kind of your mindset. I think this is a super high level order because one, I think it takes a level of perception that can give you the ability to recognize that other people have different perspectives. And then two, after you see or have that awareness to acknowledge someone else's point of view, you then relate it to your own. Like that is higher level. I mean, I think even when I'm thinking if a friend and I are kind of in a debate or we have different viewpoints, you know, it does really take like listening and being like, oh, nope, like this is what I think. And so how, you know, how to kind of do those things. And there was a term I had read somewhere. It wasn't I was debating whether to put it in there, but we didn't find a lot of research to kind of support it. But they mentioned like hot and cold EF. And they basically mentioned as hot being something like where your emotions are a little more triggered in it. So for me, like, yeah, I do honestly kind of lose a little bit of that EF of my own of like, oh, I know, like one side of my brain is like, oh, okay, Marissa, just let it go. Just let it go. Like if we're in disagreement. And the other part of my brain is just like, nope, I'm going to go. You know, it's like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to say it. I'm going to continue to, you know, harp on it. So yeah, you know, just kind of understanding like that perspective taking. So cognitive flexibility also affects how we adjust to change. So this is very common, especially within like inflexible routines, right? So how do you teach for something like this? What replacement skills might we incorporate in when we're dealing with someone who's really inflexible with changing routines?
I think, you know, we use timers a lot and like time warnings a lot with our clients.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's kind of the best way. And not necessarily like, hey, you got 5 minutes before I spring this thing on you, but like, hey, do you have a moment? Can I talk to you right now? And just like a warning sometimes is helpful. Like for me, this like cognitive flexibility thing, like if I'm doing something and you start talking to me, either I'm going to ignore you or I'm going to like half listen, or I will be annoyed because I have to drop the thing that I was doing because I will forget what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's kind of just helpful to be like, hey, are you ready to move on to the next thing?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Like a priming statement.
Yeah.
But also I like that phrase, right? Because you're also just, are you ready? Because then you're giving a little bit of that control to the other person, you know, that choice piece, which I think is super valuable. So one, two that we haven't touched on is working memory. So being able to hold info in the mind and relate that info to previously known knowledge or even new knowledge. So there's a quote from Diamond that states, problems with inhibitory control can cause children to look like as if they have a problem with any of the other EFs or are intentionally misbehaving when that is not the case. Development proceeds both from the acquisition of skills and from the increasing ability to inhibit appropriate reactions that can get in the way of demonstrating skill already present. So, you know, development takes time, and often EF or inhibitory control is not matured until early adulthood. So, you know, is there a difference between kind of like what we see behaviorally and, you know, the ability to kind of utilize executive functioning skills? What do you think, Tammy? Is there a difference? And if so, like, what does it look like?
I think oftentimes when we say behavioral, it sounds like, oh, they're doing it on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, like not doing things, I mean, doing things a certain way is behavioral, right? Like that is the thing that you can shape and you kind of work on. But I think it comes down to kind of what you expect. So it's like you want them to complete this task, but are you expecting something from them that's just not like fair based on how their brain works? Or are you breaking it down into steps and then letting them kind of work through those things on their own? So I guess in short, like I think there is a difference, but it doesn't mean that you can't work on those kind of EF skills the same way that you would work on behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, there's also a piece of what about our nonverbal clients, right? I think there's a question of, okay, is EF appropriate, number one, for teaching and dependent on that case or that individual. But also, you know, I I always think about like some of the challenges, because what's helpful, and I have worked with kiddos that do have the ability to express or label. Like one of my kids, he was 10 years old, and he was able to tell me, like, after he eloped or, went across the street and, pulled away from his mom's hand, when we were able to later, we were in a safer environment, he would say, like, it's hard for me, and so for him to express that really got me to thinking, like, he knows better, but it's super challenging for him to quote unquote do better. So I think, like, he was the first kiddo that really, and I always credit my previous experience of working with every individual genuinely has really given me so much insight to understand, right, and explore how each person is different. One kid with ADHD and ASD might be very different from a kid who has both of those diagnoses, right? So I really appreciated that encounter, because it was for the first time that I worked with a kid that was able to, like, truly express, and I could see it, in his eyes, right? Like when you genuinely, like, feel for them and you're like, okay, and I had to kind of step back and just think about that a little bit more in terms of my programming as their BCBA, like, okay, how do we approach this elopement behavior, which is super dangerous? We need, to get something in place, but, really, really had me thinking, had my wheels turning.
Yeah, and going back to what you were saying about like the nonverbal, nonvocal kids, right? Like they can't tell you this is hard. Are you just looking at them like, why aren't you doing it? Or are we kind of able to realize that maybe this is also really hard for them, even if they can't tell us, or even especially because they can't tell us?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, one of my favorite things to tell myself these days too is like, they're not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time.
Mm-hmm.
Because when they're not doing things that you want them to do, right? Sometimes it's just because they can't.
Yes.
And like in the way that we want to presume competence, we want to kind of presume that they have good intentions, that they want to do good, they want to do what you are asking them to. That doesn't mean that they're at a place where they can. So kind of goes back to like, let's program for like, let's change our environment, right? Antecedent strategies. What are we doing to kind of set them up for success?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. Such a good perspective, and kind of segueing into executive functioning skills by age. So this is a very brief breakdown, but in general, kind of just to give us all a perspective. So 0 to 2 years, remembering where the item is hitting in a new location. So kind of like detouring, reaching. These are some things or ways in which we might see EF developing, or what EF looks like at that 0 to 2 range, right? Reaching around a barrier to access an item, right? Oftentimes we might see this in programming as like locating a partially missed, partially in sight item, right? Or locating an item out of sight after like seeing me put it behind the box. That's an example. So around the 2 to 3 years, we see a little bit more rigidity in thinking. So like if I say it's a duck, let's say we're talking about pretend play, right? And we're pick up a block, it's a duck. So it's a duck. I say it's a duck, so it's a duck, period. One thing we see starting to develop is we do some reversal learning. So where they learn to reach for an identified target, they receive reinforcement, and then realize that when that reinforcement shifts to a different target or a different card, let's say we're doing this in cards, with visual cards, and in that array, we start to switch the reinforcement to the other card, and they switch their response to shift to the reinforcement. So we start to see these skills kind of going into play. Around 3 to 4 years, we started adding irrelevant information and kind of a lack of planfulness. So they can be reactive, but not proactive. So this might be conducted from color to shape sorting. Oftentimes the same color of shape sorting is still at this kind of 3 to 4 age range. When we're looking closer into later years, 5 to 8 years, we're seeing shifting from reactive to proactive and improvements within working memory, inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility. So matching, memory game, kind of that discrimination, navigating planning through recall. And we start to see some of these prerequisites for turn taking or board games kind of erupt here. And within the 6 to 11 years, we see a more focused years where they are in school settings, right? So it might be perceived as if you know better, do better, which you talked about. And this is not always the case when we're considering development. So like we discussed, it might be lack of inhibitory control to demonstrate their understanding on a test. And I do hope that in years to come that we kind of improve our educational system to be a little more inclusive in ways where standardized testing isn't the only core measure of academic success. Because oftentimes for some kids and for some individuals, it's not the measure of success for that individual. You hear a lot, especially now with social media and stuff, you hear about people who became millionaires and, graduated high school and never went to college, right? So just kind of, bringing that back to like how we measure what someone knows can be super creative, so when we're thinking about planning and treatment planning, really understanding the individual and having a more broad perspective of like, okay, I see this skill, but what are different angles that I can use to really teach that? Do you have anything to add on that, Tammy?
Yeah, it's another one of my soapboxes. It's so my first master's is in inclusive learning, like universal design. And so when I look at these things, I'm like, yeah, I mean, why would you expect everyone to do like test taking? Like that's not how everyone learns. And in fact, most people out of the way learn by like rote memory. You actually understand it if you're just memorizing it, right? And so like there's so many ways to kind of show that you understand something. And I think one of like the things that I took away from the program was really just like, what are you trying to assess? When you're doing an exam, are you trying to assess their ability to take the exam, or are you trying to assess like their ability to answer the math question or to what is it that you want? Or like even an essay, are you trying to test their writing skills or their like history? Like what is it? It's like I don't know, it's like it kind of sticks out to me that way.
So pointing out the EFs are so crucial to development throughout life. Even if we're talking about school, mental, physical health, and even social integration within our lifespan, right? Relationships that we encounter throughout our life. How we engage with others and ourselves, such as in self-talk, is huge. So research supports that prefrontal cortex has a neuroplasticity that is vulnerable to damage from environmental, physical stress, loneliness, and even poverty. So all this to consider that relating to episode 11 in our trauma-informed care, that universal approach to implementation with considering that every individual you encounter has likely has experienced some form of trauma is really, even universal in our application, right? Of not just looking at, programming for children with autism, but also understanding like executive functioning for ourselves in our daily lives. So how does EF relate to ABA? Tarbow points out that separating a more mentalistic approach to emotions, right? So words like sad, mad, instead of seeing them as, instead seeing them as learned behavior and the same as public behavior, right? So keeping the focus on behavioral principles, since that's, our jam, and staying true to the science, but that doesn't negate the existence of emotion. I think that's important. It's really utilizing like, how are we framing what emotion looks like in ways of, the behavior analytic principles we know. So although we have different perspectives for really utilizing EF to understand and concepts of mentalistic psychology, they intertwine in ways that do relate to our science, right? So instead of, we might often get, he was mad, so he bolted out of the house into the street. Well, let's reframe that, right? Into what did we see happen, right? What was going on in the environment? And kind of utilizing that approach. I think it's important to point out the relational frame theory. This is a presentation or episode in itself, so I'm not an expert on this, but just to give kind of a brief overview, because especially within ABA, acceptance and commitment therapy has really come into ABA, right? And so I think it does deserve in the future, we'll probably touch on this, but just to kind of briefly break down at least relational frame theory. So think of it as a frame shot, and one concept is taught and allows continued learning or generalization, as we would say, outside of the taught experience. So really utilizing multiple exemplars is this process so we can focus on that generalized learning. So I kind of leave that as like basic, but anything for that you might want to add, Tammy?
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive.
At least for now, short, but at least give a little
yeah, without going way too much into what like ACT looks like. And
yes. So yeah, Tammy, this is a good question. So how do we program for things like self-control?
I don't have a lot of self-control, so I don't know.
Well, that's a good comment, though. I mean, that maybe brings things back, right? Of like, self-control is very hard for adults who are quote unquote, right? We have, you and I are, not to expose too much, but we're over 20. So, like our EF skills are quote unquote mature, right? So I love that you said that to start things off is, yeah, self-control is hard to teach. How do we do that?
I kind of want to turn that around too and ask, like, how do we teach that without teaching anxiety? Because I think a lot of people, like with the ADHD community, right? People talk about like not running late all the time, or like not doing this or not doing that. And it's not necessarily because they have self-control skills. It's because they're so anxious of messing up that they don't. But I don't think, as much as we don't want to teach like masking, we also want to teach them to just be anxious that they're doing things wrong the whole time. So I don't know, that doesn't answer the question, but
no, but maybe that's more of a question we just throw up in the air, and just leave food for thought, right? Because there are a lot of things we can teach to help support self-control, waiting, right? Even tolerating no to some extent, but there's still a little bit more that goes into that too. But even as we talk about like capitalizing on motivation, how are we targeting executive functioning skills? So I know we mentioned utilizing visuals, right? Or even an example where, that I gave where the resident was getting ready, super motivated by food, right? So again, how do we get her to hold on, pause, right? Pause and maybe regain a little bit. And like you mentioned, using visual, using timers, some of those things, or even intermixing. I like how you mentioned that earlier, right? Kind of intermixing a calendar here to a calendar there, or a timer, or, because boredom is pretty typical, right? But maybe to a different extent, you might experience it than, let's say, I do. So just some insights on how we can kind of intermix these things. Did you have anything more for that?
Yeah, I mean, the whole statement about being bored and stuff, I think is really relevant in terms of like, there's this idea of if you're trying to program in transitions or waiting skills and all those things, right? Like, one, how are you programming it in a way that's going to allow like their dopamine to kind of express itself, right? Like, it's really hard to do things if you're not excited or having fun, right?
Yes.
But on the other hand, a lot of times there are like transitions of like in school settings where they're like, okay, come to circle time, wash your hands, come into circle time. And now the kids are just sitting there waiting for each other to finish washing hands or something. And so in that amount of time, and it's an adult, maybe we're like, it's only 2 minutes, they can sit. For them, they're like, well, now I have time to get distracted by the toys. I have time to get distracted by my shoes. I'm going to go to the bathroom. I don't know. And so like, how are we programming things so that the transitions aren't just like downtime?
Oh, yeah. I love that you brought in the school piece. Because I think at least for me, I have had a kiddo in a daycare or preschool setting for a while now. And that's a big thing, right? Some of those transitions where I was actually a co-BCBA and I were chatting on an overlap that we were doing. And we were both like, oh, okay, so this time period when technically you should be waiting in line, but the kids are all 4 years old. So it gets loud and rambunctious after a focused circle time. And our kiddo might be roaming around, and it's kind of like, well, but he does get around to washing his hands. And so just it kind of brought me back to that piece of also remembering, like the social significance and are we targeting behaviors that are, not necessarily going to right, like waiting in line is a big one. I don't know. I could go on a rant in that too, because I just came back from Disneyland and I hated waiting in lines. We bought the Genie Pass. I mean, you think about that, right? I mean, adults have a hard time waiting.
Yeah.
Granted, Disneyland, we're talking about, 75 minutes plus for waiting, but waiting is waiting in line is odd. Is that just me?
It's a strange skill. Like it's so important for like not losing your place, right? But yes. Otherwise, why? Why are we doing this? Well, the DMV apparently has this new system where you can like check in online and it saves your spot instead of like waiting in line. Which I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. I'm gonna go sit in my car until you're ready to call me.
I know. No, that is so true. Waiting in your car is different, than like waiting in line. It's just, yeah. So again, just bringing it back to like making sure that we're teaching, skills, replacement skills that will develop into more higher level learning, right? More higher development. So I think, just kind of encompassing some of these real life examples. Thank you, Tammy, for bringing some of these, like you mentioned, the DMV or, Disneyland, like these are things that a lot of adults might encounter and really puts things in perspective when talking about like EF.
But I think you're also like touching on something really important, which is that sometimes we're so focused on teaching the skills, but it's like the lines at Disneyland, right? Like, oh, the thing is, do they have to? Can they like walk around in a circle in their spot in line? What does it look like?
Yeah. So yeah, just going into like targeting executive functioning skills. So really kind of completion of tasks, sustained engagement in activity, recalling events, following through, tolerating changes. So one thing to remember is incorporating the autonomy and choice, right? We have referenced already a couple times the trauma-informed care episode that we've done, episode 11, but this all relates, right? And I think probably every episode that we do might very well be relevant to trauma-informed care. So really giving choice, incorporating the learner in choosing, what we're focusing on, or giving them some type of say, of course, to an age appropriate level, but when we're referencing it for EF, providing clear and concise instructions, like we mentioned through visual supports. One thing I thought about too is like errorless learning can also be helpful, of course, with, like an appropriate fade out. But, sometimes like really getting that help. I know I'm someone who like, I feel like I take direction well in some ways. And so when that's given to me and it's super clear, I know that I can do what I need to do, so I would almost rather like give me all the information I need and then I could do it. So that's where I think of like errorless learning of, just being able to show the learner how it's done and then kind of let them do the free reins, right? But, there's different approaches, you could do least to most to least, intrusive prompting, but whichever one you choose, I don't think one is wrong depending on the situation. But I think something we don't do often enough is appropriately planning for fade out from those prompts,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like we forget that that's an important piece of like, oh, I can't prompt this person forever.
Yeah, so even like you mentioned in a school setting, vocal prompts from a teacher in a group setting are pretty normal, right? So also just understanding like, yeah, what types of prompts are happening within the environment, because technically also if you have a group, you have a model prompt. you
Yeah.
know, so just some like some more food for thought. Some fun ways I was looking at, and also from the example about my mom with the Guess Who, I was thinking like, how do we teach EF, you know? And I think that keeping it fun, like we mentioned, can keep it fun for us to teach as well. So like things like the opposite games, Simon Says, Guess Who, Hoot Owl Hoot is really fun. I don't know if you've ever played that one, but I really like that one. It has kind of a team component and a little more strategy. So I think board games can be super fun and engaging to kind of learn and practice some of these executive functioning skills.
Yeah. Especially if they take forever.
Yeah. I think, yeah, Monopoly with like buying properties. They have Monopoly Junior, which is still like equally hard, just not as long. So moving on here. So we know using executive functioning skills is effortful. I think this really comes into play. Like it can be hard sometimes, you know, when we're talking about multitasking, planning, or keeping it all kind of in line in our head, right? We might have so much going on sometimes that can be a challenge. So when we talk about identifying goals and seeing EF as learned behavior, can we target EF skills like any other behavior? I think the answer is like any other behavior, it should be individualized, right? So identifying stimuli, identifying the consequences, and identifying a reinforcer, right? When we're talking about programming, breaking it down into smaller parts, really understanding, does the learner have some of the prerequisites to move forward or progress? And identifying critical skills and programming for generalization. So we talked about earlier using that multiple exemplar approach so that we can facilitate generalized learning. Anything to add to that, Tammy?
I guess I also want to add like kind of the importance of like the interdisciplinary collaboration, because there's research that kind of shows that like with EF, you know, I don't know if you've heard, like people will talk about, well, you should give that kid with ADHD lots of exercise, right? And like it's supposed to help them. And then there's like muscle strength is correlated with executive function, which is really interesting. And having more strength in your muscles and stuff can increase executive functioning, but it's not so simple as like, oh yeah, just have them like kick the bricks. Wait, that's an insult, right? I don't know. Just they can't just be kicking people, right? But it has to be like something that also builds in like self-control. So traditional martial arts is about like, controlling your body, and apparently there's research that shows that it kind of helps with building executive functioning. So it's interesting.
Yes.
But obviously it's not our like forte, but I think it makes sense because when you talk to OTs, they're always like, you don't just give them a movement break. You gotta like have it structured, right? Give them like 5 jumps or a couple minutes. Don't just be like, yeah, go and move.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you know, being able to actually, I'm super glad. Thank you for bringing like that interdisciplinary approach, because I think that you hit on a key. Like I can also always tell, like I can tell how advanced like the collaboration has the potential to be, because I'm like, okay, I'm going to take that and run with it. I once had an OT that communicated with the family. She gave him a list for the family to say, do these things with him, the kiddo, and observe him 5 to 10 minutes afterwards to see if it actually increases his regulation, or like it helps with his regulation, or it kind of is counterintuitive, right? And so I thought that was really cool, and it was a really good list that I would also, you know, oftentimes you hear like wheelbarrows or, you know, crab walks or jumping on the trampoline. Sometimes because it can all look different, right? There's a huge array, and just because we know one thing works with one kiddo, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to help with another kiddo, right? It might actually do the opposite for their own regulation. So yeah, just kind of keeping some of those. I love how you also have on here yoga. I think that's in a lot of, you know, pretty popular one that our kids use, and I find it so cute. Actually, one of my kids he was doing downward dog. And then I compliment him, like, wow, your yoga skills are really cool. And then he like just totally posed with his tree pose.
Oh,
It was so cute.
cute.
Yeah. And so I know you were going to touch on proximal, like the zone of proximal development. So go ahead and take it over for that one.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think this is kind of just what we were talking about before about like figuring out where they're at and not just expecting them to do skills that are not conducive to where their brains are at and where their skill levels are, right? And so like the zone of proximal development is kind of just bringing that in of like, well, like there's the tasks that they can't do, absolutely cannot, and there are things that they can do easily without help, and then you have like the whole part where it's like this the discomfort, right? Of like you're learning your place where you kind of don't really know what you're doing, but you have the skills to do it. That's the zone of proximal development where you want to be, because you're not, if you're addressing things that are way too easy for your clients, then they're gonna get bored. If you're doing things that are way too hard, they're just going to walk away or get mad or whatever. And so you want to be in a place where they're able to do it, but they just might need help.
Yes. And so, yeah, another great strategy, Tammy, please continue. I want to hear more about, I know we discussed outside of the recording, but yeah, tell us more about this hand model breakdown.
Okay, so Dr. Daniel Siegel has this hand model of the brain, and it's like if you consider like you're putting your hand into a fist with your thumb under your the rest of your fingers, you have the brain, and your fingers and your knuckles, that's your prefrontal cortex. And so if you flip your lid, which is like you're freaking out, you're not emotionally regulated, right? And that means your fingers are now standing up. They're not connected really. I mean, they are technically, right? But your prefrontal cortex, where the tips of your fingers are not connected to the rest of your brain. And so that's kind of the same way of like with your brain. If you are emotionally not regulated, if you're stressed out, whatever it is, then your prefrontal cortex is not able to do its job. You're not able to do executive function stuff. So I think it's a fun visual of kind of just like, oh yeah, okay, if I'm flipping my lid, I cannot get my work done. So I need to be regulated.
Yes. No, yeah, I really like that. So like the flipping the lid would kind of be like you're showing the number 4.
Yes.
And then down would be like your connectedness to your prefrontal cortex abilities or capabilities.
Yeah, because like if you imagine like your palm and your thumb being kind of like your primitive system, right? Of like all of the like survival stuff. If you're worried about survival, you're not going to be able to be thinking about like when you're not going to use the skills that you have when your prefrontal cortex is functioning the way it's supposed to, which is when your fingers are down.
Yes. That. And also something Diamond mentions in her article too, unmet emotional, social, physical needs work against displaying good executive functioning. When people are less stressed, happier, more physically fit, and socially supported, they can think more clearly and creatively and exercise better self-control and discipline. So we're going to go ahead and use, for our second code word, we'll use hand. I think that's a really cool analogy there of like how to even, or visual of, what it looks like. Okay, and as we kind of intro out, this was a really great discussion, Tammy. It was so nice, to have you on, hear about, you have a lot of versatile experience, like even like you mentioned, your multiple master's degree, but also just even your ability to relate some of these harder concepts to like real life. And, so I had a lot of fun, and we really appreciate you coming on to kind of delve into executive functioning. I don't know if you have anything else to add before we outro, but feel free to add anything. But it was so nice to have you.
No, thank you for having me. This was a fun conversation.
Yes, agreed. All right. And so a reminder, this is worth 1 CE credit. Collect your code words and head over to joyscapetherapy.com/CEUS and follow the instructions to earn your CE certificate. If you love today's content, please follow our podcast and leave us a review, as this allows us to continue getting out quality information to you all. Again, thank you so much for listening in, and we will catch you next episode.